From the moment little Clara Dawson opened her eyes to the world, life branded her with a stigma she never asked for, a scar that followed her into every classroom, every playground, and every whispered conversation. She was the prisoner's daughter. Her father, Raymond Dawson, a man with square shoulders, weather-beaten skin, and deep blue eyes that once twinkled with kindness, had been sentenced to 20 years for a crime he swore he didn't commit. Her mother, Evelyn Dawson, a thin, weary woman with tired brown eyes and hands cracked from cleaning houses, carried that shame silently, shielding Clara as best she could. But small-town America had no mercy for children born from scandal. By the time Clara was 6, she already understood what it meant to be excluded. At school, she would sit alone at lunch with her peanut butter sandwich, while whispers floated through the air. That's her. Her dad's a convict. She tried to ignore the sting, but it cut deeper when other children, with their shiny lunch boxes and smiling parents, threw cruel taunts. "Prison girl, don't let her touch you, or you'll catch it." Teachers didn't intervene. Not really, because in their eyes she was a lost cause before she could even spell the word justice. Yet inside Clara's small chest beat a stubborn heart. Each insult she swallowed became a stone in the foundation she was building inside herself, a fire that whispered, "I will prove them wrong." Life at home was no sanctuary either. Their run-down trailer smelled faintly of mildew, the roof leaked in storms, and Evelyn often cried quietly at night when she thought Clara was asleep. Clara would lie awake, listening to the soft sobs and gripping the one photograph she cherished. Her father holding her as a baby, smiling wide before prison bars claimed him. Visits to the prison were both a wound and a balm. The long, echoing hallways, the harsh buzz of metal doors, the guards' watchful eyes, all of it reminded Clara she didn't belong. Yet the moment she saw her father across the cold metal table, she felt whole again. His voice, calm but firm, carried lessons she never forgot. "Don't let the world tell you who you are, Clara. You decide that. They've already taken my life, but don't let them take yours." His words sank into her bones, even as he was escorted back behind bars. But the cruelty outside grew sharper as she got older. By middle school, rumors about her father's crimes spread like wildfire. Children repeated words they didn't understand: armed robbery, felon, dangerous, as if they were truths written on Clara's skin. Teachers shook their heads, expecting her to follow in his footsteps, and neighbors crossed the street when she walked by. The shame was unbearable, but instead of collapsing under it, Clara found herself hungering for knowledge. She spent hours in the small public library, a place where the silence didn't judge her. The heavy law books, with their endless pages of cases and precedents, fascinated her. She didn't understand most of it at first, but she read and reread until the words became familiar. What drove her wasn't just a vague interest. It was the burning question that haunted her every time she saw her father's tired eyes through a glass pane. Asterisk, what if he was innocent? What if the system had failed him the way it was failing her? Asterisk, one night, when Clara was 12, Evelyn collapsed from exhaustion after working 3 jobs. Clara sat beside her mother's hospital bed, holding her frail hand, and whispered a promise that felt like a vow carved into stone. "I'm going to fight this system. I'm going to become someone they can't ignore. One day, they'll see me not as a prisoner's daughter, but as someone who changes everything." She didn't know how she would do it, but the fire inside her had become unshakable. High school brought no relief. Mockery only sharpened as teenage cruelty grew more vicious. She was shoved into lockers, notes were passed with crude jokes about handcuffs in the family, and prom invitations never came. But while others partied, Clara worked, washing dishes, stocking shelves, saving every dollar in a jar labeled college. She kept her grades spotless, fueled by every insult hurled her way, until teachers who once dismissed her were forced to admit she was one of the brightest minds in her year. By 17, Clara stood taller, her hazel eyes no longer dimmed by shame but hardened with determination. She applied for scholarships with essays that bled honesty, about growing up in poverty, about her father behind bars, about the cruelty of labels. Admissions officers, who had read 1,000 rehearsed stories, paused when they read hers. It wasn't just resilience, it was defiance. Clara wasn't begging for pity. She was demanding to be seen. And when the acceptance letter came from a prestigious law program, she clutched it to her chest and wept, not just for herself, but for the little girl who once sat alone at lunch, humiliated and broken. She had taken their cruelty and turned it into her fuel. But even as she packed for college, Evelyn warned her gently, "They won't stop mocking you, Clara. The world will always try to remind you where you came from." Clara, her jaw set, replied, "Then I'll remind them where I'm going." With nothing but a suitcase, a second-hand laptop, and the memory of her father's words echoing in her ears, Clara stepped onto the bus that would take her out of her small town. The whispers followed her still, prisoner's daughter, but this time, she carried them like armor. What she didn't yet know was that her journey wouldn't just lead her to success. It would lead her back to the very prison that once defined her life. And when she returned, she wouldn't be walking through those doors as a visitor or as a child marked by shame. She would return as a woman who held the law in her hands, ready to turn the system inside out. Maria Alvarez had always believed the hardest part of her life was watching her father, Antonio Alvarez, disappear behind the heavy steel doors of the county prison. But the truth was, the real pain came after. For years, her classmates reminded her every single day of what she was. Not Maria, the girl who loved books, who had a smile like sunlight, who had dreams of becoming a lawyer. They only saw her as the prisoner's daughter. In hallways, she would hear whispers, some loud enough to make sure she caught every word. Asterisk, don't sit next to her. Her dad's a criminal. Asterisk, or asterisk, her family's dangerous. Stay away. Asterisk, even teachers, the people meant to inspire, looked at her differently, as if the blood in her veins was tainted because of who her father was. By high school, Maria Alvarez, tall, with dark almond-shaped eyes that carried the weight of secrets she never asked to hold, and soft curls framing her strong yet gentle face, learned to walk with her head down. She kept her notebooks pressed to her chest like armor, her heart pounding each time she stepped into a classroom. She wanted to vanish, to dissolve into the background. But what no one knew was that inside Maria Alvarez burned a storm. Every cruel whisper, every mocking laugh, every rejection wasn't breaking her. It was sharpening her. One day, when she was 16, sitting alone in the library, Maria Alvarez opened a book on constitutional law. The pages spoke to her differently than any storybook ever had. They weren't just words. They were power, power that could dismantle lies, protect the innocent, and challenge those who used cruelty as a weapon. She realized in that moment that her path wasn't to run from her father's shadow. Her path was to confront it, to reshape it, and maybe even turn it into light. Years passed. Maria Alvarez fought her way into law school, a journey lined with battles far beyond exams. When professors underestimated her, assuming she'd never last, she stayed up nights proving them wrong. When classmates whispered about her father's record, she sharpened her focus until every paper she submitted, every case she argued, left no doubt about her brilliance. By 24, Maria Alvarez was no longer the prisoner's daughter. She was Maria Alvarez, a rising lawyer whose name carried respect. But fate had a cruel sense of irony. The very prison where her father had once lived his worst days called her back. Not as a visitor, not as a child searching for dignity, but as its new legal director. Standing before the gates again, Maria Alvarez felt her chest tighten. She saw the towering barbed wire fences, the gray stone walls weathered with time, the same steel doors that had once swallowed her father whole. Her reflection in the glass of the entry doors caught her off guard. No longer a scared teenager, but a woman with sharp determination in her eyes, her jaw strong, her presence commanding. Inside, the warden shook her hand with a smile that carried more politics than warmth. Guards eyed her curiously, whispers stirring through the staff. But Maria Alvarez walked steady, heels clicking against the tiled floor, her heart echoing louder than the sound. This wasn't just a job for her. This was reclamation. For every insult she had endured, every laugh at her expense, every time she had been told her life was destined to fail, this was her answer. Still, as she toured the halls, memories flooded in. She passed the visiting room where she had once sat across from her father, Antonio Alvarez. His weathered face, his tired eyes, the way his rough hands had held hers through the glass. She remembered the ache of leaving him behind. Now, walking those same halls, she thought of him not with shame, but with love and with the knowledge that his past did not define her present. But Maria Alvarez's story wasn't about revenge. It was about rewriting the ending everyone else had already written for her. And as she stepped into her office, the heavy oak desk polished to a shine, the shelves lined with legal texts, she sat down and whispered to herself. Asterisk, they mocked me for being a prisoner's daughter. Now they'll respect me as the lawyer who owns this place. Asterisk, what Maria Alvarez didn't know was that the hardest part of her journey wasn't the past she had already overcome. It was the future waiting just around the corner. And the choices she would have to make inside those very walls would test not just her skills as a lawyer, but her heart as a daughter. If you're hooked by Maria's story and can't wait to see what happens next, make sure to like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss. By the time Amelia Rivera, long black wavy hair, sharp determined eyes that still carried shadows of childhood pain, always dressed in professional yet humble clothes, entered her final year of law school, the weight of her past bore down on her more than ever. She had fought tooth and nail to reach this far, working endless shifts at a diner, studying late nights with coffee-stained notes, and forcing herself to believe that she was not defined by her father's prison number. Yet the whispers never went away. In courtrooms where she interned, older lawyers would smirk when they remembered her last name, murmuring things like, "The prisoner's daughter wants to argue justice." Professors who were supposed to be mentors often overlooked her, assuming someone like her didn't belong in the polished halls of legal institutions. The cruel irony was that her passion for law wasn't born from privilege or ambition. It was carved into her from years of watching her mother cry while filling out forms she couldn't understand, from seeing her father shackled in a visiting room, unable to explain the system that had swallowed him whole. Amelia didn't just want to be a lawyer. She needed to prove that children like her could rise from the ashes of shame. Every rejection letter from prestigious firms stung like salt in an old wound, but every one only fueled her defiance. When no one would hire her, she created her own path, taking small pro bono cases for inmates and their families. She'd walk into prisons, the same kind of place where she once sat as a scared little girl, but this time she walked in wearing heels and carrying case files instead of fear. The guards, who used to pat her down as a child, now nodded respectfully as Attorney Rivera. Still, it wasn't easy. Nights found her crying into her pillow, doubting herself, wondering if she was chasing an impossible dream. But the memory of a moment when she was 15 always pulled her back. She had sat across the glass from her father, who had placed his palm against the divider and whispered, "Mija, if you ever want to prove the world wrong, do it in a way that makes them listen." Make them listen, Amelia. That memory became her fire. The mockery she faced transformed into fuel, the humiliation into strategy. Her first big case, defending a wrongfully accused young man from her neighborhood, was like facing the ghosts of her father's trial. The courtroom was filled with faces that doubted her, the same kind of men and women who had dismissed her father's pleas decades ago. But Amelia stood there, her voice trembling at first, then rising into sharp conviction. She exposed lies in the prosecution's timeline, tore apart flawed evidence, and gave a closing argument so raw that jurors wept. When a verdict came back, not guilty, she didn't just win a case. She carved her name into the fabric of justice. Word spread. The prisoner's daughter was no longer the butt of whispered insults. She was a force to be reckoned with. Slowly, she built her practice, and slowly, she built her reputation. Yet even as her career rose, the scars stayed. She'd return to her small apartment at night, sit by the window overlooking the city lights, and whisper to herself, "One day, I won't just walk into these prisons. I'll own the power inside them." The dream seemed outrageous, impossible even, but then again, so did every step of her journey so far. And Amelia Rivera was not done fighting. If anything, the world hadn't seen her at her fiercest yet. Don't forget to like, comment, And subscribe if you want to see how Amelia's battle to turn her deepest wound into her greatest strength unfolds. Life has a strange way of circling back to the places we once thought we had escaped forever. And for Elena, that circle came with a cruel but defining twist. By now, she was not the broken girl from her teenage years, but a fierce, determined woman with fire in her eyes and wisdom in her scars. She had already built her name as a sharp young lawyer, one who fought tooth and nail for people who were discarded by society, especially the children of inmates and marginalized families who often carried the same shame she once bore. But her rise was not without constant reminders of her past, and one of those reminders arrived like a dagger to her heart the day she walked into the courtroom and saw Marcus Reed, the very judge who had once signed off on her father's sentence, seated on the bench. His gray hair and weathered face carried the years with dignity, but Elena recognized his piercing gaze immediately. It was the same gaze that had looked down at her when she was a little girl clutching her mother's hand, hearing the words that stole her father away. In that moment, every ounce of her childhood pain rushed back, being called names at school, hiding her father's prison letters under her pillow, crying in silence while pretending she didn't care. But instead of shrinking, Elena straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and delivered her opening arguments with the kind of clarity and courage that made the entire courtroom go still. Her voice didn't tremble. Her words didn't waver. And when the hearing ended, Marcus looked at her, not as a broken prisoner's daughter, but as a formidable lawyer whose brilliance was undeniable. That single encounter was the moment she realized her past was no longer a curse, but a weapon sharpened by resilience. Still, the biggest battle of her life lay ahead. Weeks later, Elena received an unexpected call. The prison board was searching for a new legal counsel, someone with fresh vision who could help reform the outdated, corrupt, and crumbling system that had failed so many lives, including her father's. When she first heard the offer, she froze. The thought of walking back into the prison that had defined her childhood pain made her stomach churn, but something deeper whispered that this was not just an offer. It was destiny calling her name. She spent nights awake, pacing the floor of her small apartment, replaying every moment of her life that led to this point. She remembered the taunts, prisoner's daughter, jailbird's kid, the laughter that chased her down hallways. She remembered her father's letters, filled with love and regret, telling her to keep fighting, to rise above, to turn the story of their family into something no one could mock. And she remembered her mother's quiet, exhausted face, working double shifts just to keep food on the table. The offer wasn't just a job. It was a chance to reclaim her family's honor, to flip the script that had haunted her since childhood. When Elena finally walked through the gates of that prison, not as a visiting child with tears in her eyes, but as a lawyer in a perfectly pressed suit with case files in her hands, every step felt like a revolution. The guards who had once smirked at her as a little girl now opened the doors with respect. The inmates looked at her with curiosity, some even recognition, as rumors spread quickly. The prisoner's daughter had returned, but not in chains. She had returned with power. She had returned with purpose. And as Elena sat in the boardroom, across from men who had likely never imagined a woman like her in such a position, she spoke with conviction about reform, justice, and second chances. She argued that prisons shouldn't only punish but rehabilitate, that people weren't monsters but products of broken systems, and that true justice meant giving people a road back to humanity. Some of the board members scoffed. Others leaned in, captivated. By the end of that meeting, they weren't just listening to her. They were nodding, agreeing, even applauding. And when the decision was made, Elena was unanimously chosen as the new legal director of the institution that had once been her greatest nightmare. That night, as she sat alone in her car outside the prison, she stared at the looming walls and barbed wire under the moonlight. Instead of fear, she felt peace. She had finally rewritten her story, standing tall where once she had cowered. But deep inside, she also knew this was only the beginning. The real test would come when she had to face the darker truths, the corruption inside, the guards who abused their power, the politicians who wanted prisons to stay as cages instead of places of change. Yet Elena wasn't afraid anymore. She had been forged in fire, and now she was ready to set the whole world ablaze with justice. Her story was no longer about shame, it was about transformation. And as she drove away, she whispered to herself the words her father had written long ago. Asterisk, we are not defined by where we begin, but by where we choose to end. That if you want to see how Elena's fight reshapes not just her life, but the lives of countless others, and how she turns her pain into unstoppable power, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The courtroom was so silent that you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, and yet inside Emily's chest, it felt like a storm was raging, her heart pounding like a gavel, striking endlessly in her mind. She stood at the polished wooden table, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles went pale, her dark hair pulled back neatly into a bun, her black tailored suit framing her lean but steady figure. The posture of a woman who had walked through fire and somehow emerged without burning. Across from her, seated in a chair that looked far too small for his arrogance, was Judge Walter Kent, the man who years ago had stood in this very city and sneered about her family's worthlessness, the man who laughed at her mother's pleas for justice and dismissed her father as human trash before signing the paperwork that sentenced him. Time had added weight to his face, deep creases to his forehead, but Emily could still see the same smug shadow in his eyes, and she knew every scar on her own life had been deepened by that man's ink-stained signature. And now, fate had twisted everything, because Judge Kent wasn't sitting on the bench. He was the one on trial, his corruption uncovered, his backroom deals exposed, his fingerprints smudged all over cases that had destroyed countless lives for profit. Emily had been chosen to lead the case, and though her chest tightened every time she looked at him, she didn't tremble, not anymore. This was her stage, and she had waited her whole life to stand here. Her opening statement was like fire, her voice echoing through the chamber, deliberate, heavy, every word cutting through the silence like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone low but steady, her dark eyes fixed on them with the intensity of someone who had lived the truth she was about to speak. "This case is not only about corruption. It is about the countless lives shattered under the weight of one man's abuse of power. It is about the daughters and sons who sat outside cold walls while their parents were condemned unfairly, about families who lost hope while others profited. And it is about accountability, the kind that cannot be bought, silenced, or hidden." The jury's eyes never left her, and for the first time, the city's most powerful people began to realize that Emily Martinez, the girl they had once mocked for being the prisoner's daughter, had grown into the woman who would tear their empire down piece by piece. But Judge Kent smirked, leaning back in his chair, whispering something to his attorney with the casual arrogance of a man who had been untouchable for decades. That smirk only fueled Emily's fire. She pulled out letters from families ruined by his sentences, testimonies from men and women who had spent years behind bars because their innocence wasn't as profitable as their conviction, and every time she read aloud the words, "My children grew up without me," or "My mother died before I was released," her voice cracked with controlled fury, her pain woven into every syllable. And as the evidence piled high like bricks sealing Judge Kent's fate, Emily found her voice trembling not out of weakness, but because her fight was never about revenge. It was about rewriting the story for every child like her, who had sat on the other side of prison glass and wondered if their life was doomed by someone else's cruelty. And just as she sat down, she caught Judge Kent staring at her, his smirk fading ever so slightly, and in that fleeting moment she knew. He finally saw her not as the little girl from a broken family, but as the lawyer who would end him. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing, and Emily exhaled slowly, her hand brushing the old silver bracelet her mother had given her, the one she had worn in every trial as a reminder of who she was and where she came from. For the first time in her life, Emily wasn't just surviving the story others wrote for her. She was writing her own, and it was powerful enough to shake even the most unshakable. And as the gavel finally struck to adjourn for the day, Emily whispered under her breath, almost like a promise, "Dad, I'm doing this for you." If this story has you hooked, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for the next part. because Emily's fight is just beginning. Years had passed since Maria, once the broken and ridiculed daughter of a prisoner, first stepped into that courtroom trembling under the weight of stares and whispered judgments. And now she stood inside the very prison that had once defined her pain, but no longer as the girl who carried shame on her shoulders, rather as the woman who had rewritten her story, a lawyer and owner of the facility itself, transforming it into a place of reform and second chances. She walked slowly through the halls where echoes of suffering still lingered, her heels clicking against the concrete floors. But this time the guards saluted her, the staff looked up to her, and the very walls that once seemed like chains now felt like foundations of victory. The memories of her childhood, the cruel laughter of classmates mocking her for being the prisoner's daughter, flashed in her mind, but instead of breaking her, they now fueled her sense of triumph. Every insult was now a stepping stone that had lifted her higher. Standing at the podium during the inauguration ceremony of the new prison reform program, her voice was steady but rich with emotion as she told the crowd that gathered, judges, attorneys, former inmates, and even people from the community who once doubted her. This place was once the symbol of my family's pain, but today it is a symbol of justice, dignity, and second chances. I do not own it for power. I own it for purpose. Her words struck deep. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, and a wave of applause shook the room. Her mother, now frail with age but glowing with pride, sat in the front row, tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched her daughter dismantle the shame that had haunted their family for years. Her mother whispered under her breath, "Your father would be proud, Maria." And though Maria's chest ached at the memory of the man whose mistakes had cost them so much, she also felt that somewhere in spirit, he was watching, relieved that his daughter had risen above the shadow of his prison walls. After the event, Maria walked back in her office, a grand yet simple room inside the building, lined with law books and framed photographs of milestones she had achieved. On her desk sat a letter she had received earlier that day from a young girl in the town, who confessed she too was the daughter of a prisoner and had thought her life was doomed, until she heard Maria's story. The girl ended her letter with, "Because of you, I believe I can be more than what the world says I am." Maria pressed the letter to her heart, her eyes welling with tears, realizing this was her true victory. Not ownership, not wealth, not applause, but the power to change lives and prove that no label, no shame, and no scar from the past could define who you would become. That night, as she walked out into the evening air, the prison lights glowing behind her like beacons in the dark, she lifted her face toward the sky and whispered, "I made it." The wind carried her words, almost as if in response, and she felt the weight of generations of silence and suffering lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just Maria, the prisoner's daughter. She was Maria, the lawyer who turned chains into keys, scars into strength, and shame into legacy. And her story would live on not just in walls of steel and stone, but in every person who dared to rise above the name the world tried to give them. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe ***.